The fluorescent lights hummed their low mechanical prayer, and nobody knew what they were standing next to. Mercy General's night shift breathed quiet in Savannah's humid darkness. 2:36 a.m., the hour when sleep deprivation makes ghosts of everyone walking the corridors. 8 months Megan O'Brien had been moving through these halls, and in 8 months, not a single person had asked her last name twice. They called her the night shift nurse. Cordial. Competent. Invisible. They had no idea that the hand steadying their 4 lines had once held a soldier's throat closed while a medic applied pressure to stop the bleeding from a blast fragment that never should have missed. They didn't know. They couldn't know. Her entire service record was classified so thoroughly that officially, Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien had been erased 15 years ago, ordered to disappear into civilian life and never surface again. Her hands moved through the hospital's routine with the kind of efficiency that made other nurses slightly uncomfortable, not because she was faster, but because she never seemed to hesitate. No second guessing. No checking twice. Just hands that knew exactly what they were doing, moving like muscle memory written into bone. Trauma Bay 3 held a 68-year-old with acute hypertension and a confused expression. The morning admission had left 2 blown fours in his arms, tourist bruises, the both of them, collapsed vessels after a dehydration crisis. Megan approached with a 22-gauge needle, her fingers reading the inside of his left elbow the way a musician reads sheet music. The skin was cool. Dehydrated. The radial pulse was racing, 106 beats per minute, already climbing. One vein stood proud beneath the surface, not quite a river but enough. She didn't announce herself. She didn't ask permission. She prepped the site with an alcohol pad and the needle went in clean, a single perfect pulse of blood into the hub confirming placement. The old man exhaled relief he didn't know he was holding. Megan taped the 4 down with the precision of someone who had done this in sandstorms and blackout conditions, in trucks careening across Tikrit's fractured streets at midnight, in field hospitals where the margin between living and dying was measured in seconds and steady hands. She was rolling the 4 stand back toward the supply station when she felt him watching. Dr. Hargrove stood in the bay doorway, silk tie still pristine at nearly 3 in the morning, his expression the particular mixture of boredom and calculation that marked him as someone who'd learned to weaponize his own indifference. He'd been at Mercy General for 4 years, long enough to establish himself as the kind of doctor who got referrals and referral bonuses, who made decisions that looked medically sound but somehow always benefited his bottom line. His gaze tracked Megan's hands as she moved, and something flickered behind his eyes, not recognition, exactly, but the momentary pause of someone noticing something he couldn't immediately categorize. She was aware of him the way soldiers are always aware of the room, peripheral threat assessment, male, mid-50s, 185 pounds, built like someone who'd done racquetball in his 40s and quit, carries his aggression in his shoulders. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, bright, clear, and utterly without warmth. That was efficient, he said. Not quite a compliment. More like an observation he was filing away for later analysis. Megan glanced over, her posture already adjusting to the hospital hierarchy that required her to be smaller in the presence of his title. Dehydrated vessels collapse easy. Sometimes it just takes patience. Where did you train? His question landed like a formality, the kind doctors ask nurses to confirm they haven't wandered in from the street. Atlanta. The lie was soft, rehearsed, part of the cover story that had been her name and address and history for 15 years. Atlanta. Nursing degree from Georgia State. No military service. No classified record. No ghost of a woman who'd once been called steady in field hospitals across Iraq. That woman didn't exist anymore. She existed only in sealed files in the Pentagon and in the muscle memory of hands that knew exactly how to save a life when the world was coming apart. Dr. Hargrove nodded, but his eyes lingered on her hands, on the thin white scars that traced her right index and middle finger, barely visible unless you knew what you were looking for, the kind of scars that came from handling contaminated equipment in surgical theaters where gloves degraded and blood was acid. He was building something, Megan realized. Categorizing her into whatever box he kept marked useful tools or potential complications. She'd spent 15 years reading situations like this, the predatory assessment of someone calculating advantage and angle. She turned back to her work without waiting for dismissal, moving with the practiced deference of someone who'd learned that invisibility was survival. The break room was empty at 3:15 a.m., which meant Megan could sit for exactly 12 minutes and drink cold coffee without making conversation. The fluorescent fixtures buzzed their familiar electronic static, and beyond the small window, the parking lot sprawled empty under mercury lights that made everything look like it was being viewed through someone else's nightmare. Her locker sat in the corner of the nurse's station, standard hospital-issue metal, combination lock, nothing distinguishing it from the others except the small plastic nameplate that said O'Brien. She'd never put a photo inside, never decorated it with the loose debris of civilian life, no pictures of nieces or nephews, no vacation postcards, no magnets or stickers. Just her backup scrubs, regulation shoes, and at the very bottom of the metal box, tucked inside a worn leather jacket she never wore anymore, a combat badge wrapped in faded cotton cloth. She hadn't touched it in 5,847 days. She knew the exact count because there were some numbers the body simply kept track of, the way it kept track of heartbeat and breath. One of the respiratory therapists named Marcus passed through the break room around 3:22 a.m., and he nodded at Megan with the kind of recognition that meant nothing, the polite acknowledgement one person gives another who exists in the same space. They'd worked together for 6 months. His daughter had asthma. He drank his coffee black and always refilled the pot when it ran low. They were neighbors in the landscape of night shift, cordial enough, but there was always a careful distance that nobody seemed to question. Megan had learned early that getting close to people required having a history, and her history was a locked door. Marcus had tried once, weeks ago, to ask her about her weekend, and she'd given him nothing, just a smile that didn't reach her eyes and a redirect to the monitor bank where someone's oxygen sound was dropping. After that, the distance had settled in, and it was safer that way. Fewer questions. Fewer opportunities for the smallest detail to unravel the entire architecture of her new life. By 4:36 a.m., the hospital had settled into its deepest rhythm. 2 admissions in ICU, 1 post-op in recovery who was sleeping through the morphine, a psychiatric patient in observation who'd tried to hurt herself and was now cuffed to a bed with a sitter watching her breathe. Megan worked the east corridor, checking monitors, adjusting for rates, emptying Foleys with the mechanical efficiency of routine. She was reading a chart at the nurse's station when her eyes caught something that didn't belong. A billing note on the post-op in bed 437, a surgical consult from Dr. Hargrove, dated yesterday, for a procedure Megan had witnessed firsthand while working trauma intake. The surgery had been performed by a resident under supervision, a straightforward appendectomy that the resident had handled competently while Hargrove stood in the corner reviewing his phone. The note in the chart charged the patient's insurance for a full surgical consult at $2,400, listed Hargrove as the primary surgeon, and contained 0 reference to the resident who'd actually performed the work. Megan stared at the chart for maybe 5 seconds. She didn't let her face change. She didn't let her breathing shift. She simply closed the file, returned it to the rack, and moved to the next patient without acknowledgement. This was information. This was data. And data was how you survived situations where you couldn't fight directly. She'd learned that in field hospitals where supplies were rationed and you had to know exactly what you had, exactly what you didn't have, and exactly what was being stolen. She'd learned it in Tikrit, watching supply chains collapse while people died from preventable complications. She understood systems. She understood how to track inconsistencies. And she understood that what she'd just seen was the kind of thing that got doctors fired or prosecuted, the kind of thing that required documentation and patience, and the kind of quiet that meant you absolutely never said anything until you had the entire picture. The last hour of her shift stretched towards 6:53 a.m., the moment when day shift would arrive and the night crew would hand off like relay runners finally dropping the baton. Megan moved through her closing tasks, restocking carts, charting final notes, confirming medication counts with the incoming pharmacy tech. Her hands moved through each action with the same precision they'd always had, the same steadiness that no amount of time could erase. Muscle memory was a form of haunting. It lived in tissue and nerve and the electrical patterns that made up memory itself. Her hands remembered Tikrit. They remembered field surgery in a converted school building. They remembered the weight of holding someone's sternum open while their heart raced beneath your gloved fingers like a bird trying to escape a cage. They remembered all of it, and there was nothing Megan could do except keep them steady and moving and useful in this fluorescent-lit hospital in Savannah, Georgia, where nobody knew what they were standing next to. Dr. Hargrove passed her in the hallway at 5:53 a.m., and he paused, just barely, just enough that Megan noticed, to let his eyes move across her face. He was still processing her. Still categorizing. Still building whatever framework he decided she fit into. "Good work last night," he said, the words casual but weighted, like he was filing them away for a reason that would become clear later. She nodded acknowledgement, nothing more, and moved past him toward the supply station. Behind her, she heard him continuing down the hall, his footsteps confident, his phone already in his hand, already working the next angle. Megan kept moving. She knew how to be invisible. She knew how to wait. She knew, from 15 years of classified protocols and sealed records, that the most dangerous person in any room was always the one nobody was watching. And now Dr. Hargrove had no idea that he'd just made his first mistake. He'd let her see his arithmetic, and she would remember every number. Room 347 smelled like antiseptic and fear. The elderly couple sat rigidly in plastic chairs, husband's hand gripping his wife's knee, their daughter standing with her phone up, recording. The patient lay between them, post-op from what was supposed to be a minor surgical consult. Megan had already charted the procedure notes 3 times, cross-referencing the billing codes, and the numbers didn't align. They never did, not with Dr. Hargrove. She stood at the bedside, vital stable, O2 sat 96%, and looked directly at the daughter. "May I ask a quick clarification?" The girl lowered her phone slightly, suspicious. Megan turned to the monitors, keeping her voice clinical and steady. "Your father's chart lists a level for surgical consult. That's a complex procedure requiring surgeon presence. But I was here when Dr. Hargrove came through at 0630. He reviewed the imaging for 4 minutes, wrote an order for a resident to handle the actual intervention, and left." She pulled up the chart on the computer, her finger steady on the screen. The consult should have been billed as level 2. The resident performed the work. This is a $400 difference. The wife's eyes widened. The husband squeezed tighter. Megan continued, her tone matter-of-fact. "I'm not questioning the care. The care was appropriate. I'm questioning the documentation." She looked back at them, hands folded. "You should know what you're being charged for." The daughter's phone was recording everything. Megan left the room to check on her other patients, knowing what would happen next. It always did. Hargrove would hear about it within the hour. He always heard everything, and he would respond not with explanation but with performance. With witnesses. With humiliation designed to establish hierarchy. She didn't have to wait long. He found her at the medication cart on the 2nd floor, pulling up the afternoon doses. His voice came first, loud enough to carry down the hallway. Loud enough to make 3 nurses look up from their stations. "Ms. O'Brien." A word. Megan turned slowly, capping the syringe. His voice had that tone, the one that made residents flinch. She straightened, waiting. He walked closer, deliberately close, his presence like a tank idling in a garage, all contained power and the threat of movement. Behind him, the patient's daughter appeared with her phone still recording. The wife and husband stood in the doorway of room 347, watching. "You were in my patient's room." Not a question. His eyes were flat, predatory. Questioning medical decisions. In front of the family. Megan said nothing. She held his gaze, steady as a surgical laser. "A glorified bedpan technician," he said, each word precise, each word designed to land. "Who should stick to taking vitals instead of questioning actual medical professionals? Do you even understand what a consult entails, or should I draw you a diagram?" The hallway went quiet. Even the ventilator seemed to pause. Megan took one slow breath through her nose. The kind of breath that comes before action. Before consequence. Her eye stayed locked on his, and when she spoke, her voice came out low and clear, a voice like steel on glass. "I've held more lives in my hands than you've billed for, Doctor." Hargrove's jaw tightened. His face flashed red, then darker red, and for a moment, just a moment, he looked like he might respond. But he didn't. He couldn't. Because she'd said it exactly where he wanted to humiliate her, in front of witnesses, and she'd broken the unspoken rule. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't apologized. She hadn't retreated. She'd answered him with quiet authority that filled the space like pressure. She wiped the single tear that had escaped, her eyes never leaving his, then turned back to the medication cart. Her hands moved with absolute steadiness, drawing up the afternoon doses, the needle clicking into the syringe with mechanical precision. Behind her, she heard Hargrove's footsteps retreat. She heard the family murmur to each other in confused, grateful tones. She heard the daughter's phone screen go dark. The work continued. The shift continued. Everything appeared normal on the surface. But the next day, everything changed. The break room went silent when Megan entered. For nurses at the corner table, Sarah Chen, who'd eaten lunch with her for 8 months, Jessica from nights, Patricia from the ICU rotation, and Tom, all of them suddenly fascinated by their phones. 2 residents who'd been laughing about something in the corner went quiet, gathered their coffee, and left as if the room had become contaminated. Janet from pediatrics, who'd waved at her yesterday, actually stood mid-sandwich and walked out without explanation. Megan took her lunch to the corner table anyway. She'd eaten alone before. She'd done harder things than silence. By Thursday, the unit board had changed. The public board, the one everyone saw during shift change, now displayed a new section, Performance Notes, Staff. Below it, in careful printed letters, Ember Bryan, tardiness 11/3, 11/7, 11/9. Megan had badge swipe records for all 3 dates. She'd clocked in at 18:47, 18:42, and 18:51. All within the 5-minute grace period. All verifiable. Medication error, wrong dosage charted for patient 4267, 11/5. Patient 4267 had received insulin. Megan had charted 10 units. The order was for 10 units. The medication administration record showed 10 units. The patient's blood glucose had responded correctly. The error didn't exist. Failure to follow chain of command regarding patient care decisions. Translation, she'd spoken up. Megan stood in front of the board for exactly 30 seconds, reading it once, then looked away. She didn't touch it. She didn't defend it. She didn't gather evidence or prepare a counter-argument. That would come later, if necessary. For now, she absorbed the message, "You are being removed from this community." The break room became a different kind of empty over the next 2 days. When Megan entered, conversation didn't stop gradually, it stopped like a record skipping. Heads turned away. Phones came out. Sarah, who used to sit next to her, now sat at the opposite end with her back carefully positioned to exclude Megan from her sight line. When their hands had touched reaching for the coffee pot on Tuesday, Sarah had pulled back as if the surface was hot. By Friday, Megan stopped using the break room. She ate at the desk between patients. She clocked out and left immediately. She didn't ask anyone if they wanted anything from the vending machine. She existed in the space between shifts, neither fully part of the day crew nor the night crew, a nurse who showed up, did the work, and disappeared. And Hargrove watched all of it. She'd seen him standing at the hallway junction on Wednesday, arms crossed, satisfaction sitting on his face like a skin. Saw him again on Thursday, watching Sarah lean away from the medication cart when Megan approached. By Friday, he'd stopped bothering to hide his surveillance. He was confident now. She was breaking. The story was ending the way he'd written it. The only problem was the story wasn't finished. At 02:47 hours on Saturday morning, the ambulance bay doors burst open and the sirens cut off mid-wail. Megan was 3 minutes into her night shift, still finishing handoff notes, when the paramedic radio crackled, "Mercy General, this is Medic 12. Incoming trauma, single motorcycle versus guardrail. Male patient, approximately 35, unconscious at scene, no identification, unknown medical history. BP 78/40 on load, heart rate 130, respiratory rate shallow. ETA for minutes." Megan set down her pen and moved without thinking. Her body had already registered the call, already shifted into the state that existed below consciousness, the one that didn't require decision. She was trauma certified. She was what came next. She was reaching for the trauma bay setup when Dr. Hargrove appeared, still in his golf shirt from whatever Friday night thing he'd left early to come manage, and immediately started issuing orders to residents who stood like saplings in wind. Megan ignored him. She pulled up the trauma protocol, positioned the surgical trays, had a nurse pull O-negative blood, and prepped the bay for someone who was bleeding out and nobody knew why. The paramedic team came through at exactly the 4-minute mark, gurney rolling, for running, chest rising and falling in shallow, urgent gasps. No wallet. No phone. No identification of any kind. The leather jacket was soaked through with blood the color of old pennies, and the man's skin had the waxy pallor that meant significant blood loss. Megan moved to the patient's left side. "I need to assess for internal bleeding," she said to the team. "Help me cut the jacket." The scissors came out, her trauma shears, the ones that had been cutting through armor and leather for, she didn't count anymore. The jacket peeled away in pieces. The man's shirt came next. Chest clear. Abdomen distending, rigid, that was the bleed. Lower abdomen. Pelvic fracture maybe. She ran her hands over his ribs with the focused intensity of someone reading Braille, checking for crepitus, broken bone ends moving underneath skin. His breathing was deteriorating. The paramedics had run 2 liters wide open, but the BP was still dropping, 72/38 now, heart rate climbing because the body knew the truth his mind couldn't process, not enough oxygen, not enough volume, not enough time. The jacket was nearly off now, one arm still caught in the lining. Megan pulled it free with her left hand while her right stayed on the patient's abdomen, maintaining pressure over the probable injury site. The lining tore as the jacket came away, and something fell out, small, faded, hand-sewn. A patch. 75th Regiment. Army Ranger. Megan's hands froze for exactly half a second. The world compressed into that stillness. Then the monitor alarmed and her body moved again, because that was how it worked. The heart stopped, the hand started. Emotion was information. Shock was data. She filed both away. The jacket was completely off now, discarded onto the floor, and that's when Marcus Webb looked up from the 4-pump. Marcus, who'd been pulling his EMT rotation between his nursing prerequisites, Marcus who was young enough that Savannah felt new to him and old enough to know what he was seeing. His face changed. Megan was checking the patient's legs for fractures, already running through the trauma sequence, when she heard Marcus whisper something to the paramedic beside him. The paramedic moved away. Marcus stepped closer to the patient's side, and his eyes went to Megan's hands. Specifically to her hands. To the way she'd just run a 3-twist tourniquet around the ranger's lower leg with a pressure check and a securing knot that took exactly 3 seconds and wouldn't slip. The method that nobody learned anymore. The method that came from a place and a time she'd spent 15 years not acknowledging. Marcus's voice was barely audible. "Tikrit." Not a question. A statement. A recognition. "You were the surgeon they called steady." Holy shit. "You're her." Megan's eyes snapped to his. Sharp. Warning. Cold. "You're mistaken," she said. Flat. Final. No elaboration. No explanation. But Marcus had already pivoted to see her face, and his eyes were wide in that particular way of someone watching mythology step out of a story and start breathing in the trauma bay in front of him. "No. I was at Camp Fallujah when they brought in the asset from the collapsed safe house in the Jolan. You operated for 11 hours straight under mortar fire. Sarah Patterson was your surgical tech. You saved her whole. Not now, Megan cut him off. Her voice dropped into a register that wasn't angry, was somehow worse than angry. It was the voice of someone who didn't need to be angry because she had authority that existed independent of emotion. Help me get him stabilized or we lose him. Now. The patient's monitor started alarming. BP 65/30. The body was shutting down. The compensatory mechanism was failing. They had minutes at best, maybe seconds. Marcus moved without another word because that voice had erased his question. Megan's hands went back to the patient, palpating, assessing, running through the calculation that lived in the part of her brain that had been trained in field hospitals and phi-base medical tents and the back of Hums doing twice the speed limit because someone was dying and the only thing standing between life and death was the steady tremor of hands that knew exactly what to do. The trauma team rallied around her because that's what happened when a person who'd been invisible suddenly became unmistakable. Hargrove was still barking orders, but nobody was listening to him anymore. They were watching the nurse who moved like someone who'd held other people's lives in her hands. Because she had. And the patch, the small, faded 75th Regiment patch, lay on the trauma bay floor where it had fallen, a detail nobody had noticed yet. A detail that would wait until the next moment when the world decided to tear itself open. But for now, there was only the patient. Only the work. Only the hands that knew how to save him, doing it. The ambulance bay doors burst open at 2:08 a.m., and the wail of the siren cut through Savannah's humid darkness like a blade. Trauma intake. Motorcycle versus guardrail on Victory Drive. The paramedics wheeled in a John Doe, mid-30s, leather jacket soaked crimson, no wallet, no ID, no way to know his name or his blood type or whether his wife was waiting up at home wondering why he hadn't called. Megan was there before the stretcher stopped rolling, her eyes already cataloguing the damage, the angle of his left arm, the shallow breathing, the grey undertone creeping into his skin that meant blood was going somewhere it shouldn't. "Talk to me," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone used to being listened to. The paramedic, a kid named Torres with coffee stains on his collar, rattled off vitals in clipped hospital shorthand, BP 118/76, heart rate 98, respiratory 22, on room air, GCS 12 and dropping. Hit the rail at maybe 70 miles per hour, ejected 30 feet, found him conscious but confused. Lost about 2 liters in transport, we gotten 4 in, 18 gauge, running wide open. Motorcycle injuries. Everyone was a lottery ticket that came up broken. Megan moved into the bay, her hands already reaching for the trauma shears hanging from her waist, the same shears she'd carried from Tikrit to Kandahar to here, her call sign steady engraved so faint now you could barely see it. The jacket had to come off. The assessment couldn't wait. She cut through the leather with practiced efficiency, the shears snapping through the material like she was opening a letter, and peeled away the blood-soaked fabric to examine his torso for the punctures and lacerations that would tell her where the bleeding was coming from. That's when her hand stopped. Sewn into the jacket's lining, threaded with what looked like black dental floss and stitched with the kind of precision that only came from doing it 100 times before, was a patch. Faded. Nearly colorless. But unmistakable. 75th Regiment. Army Rangers. Hand-sewn. Which meant this man had worn it through deployments and kept it hidden long enough to stitch it back in after someone removed it officially. Which meant she wasn't alone. Steady. The voice came from the corner of the bay, low and barely audible over the monitor's steady beep. Marcus Webb stood there in his EMT rotation blues, the ones he wore while finishing his certification before shipping back to the fleet to retrain as a medic, and his eyes were wide, fixed on her hands as they moved through the field assessment with muscle memory that predated the scrubs by 15 years. His hands moved to steady the John Doe's left arm, aligning the elbow, supporting the shoulder with the kind of precise compression that only came from field training. Tikrit? You were the surgeon they called steady. It wasn't a question. Megan didn't answer. Answers could wait. The bleeding couldn't. She got the 4 placement checked, confirmed 2 18-gauge lines, and ordered packed red blood cells brought to the bay for units, stat, because the color of his skin was telling her the hemorrhage was ongoing. The X-rays came back within 4 minutes, fractured ribs on the left side, pneumothorax, and something else. Something that made her jaw tighten just slightly. His heart wasn't moving the way it should have been. The cardiac silhouette was too still. Too quiet. Ultrasound, she said. Handheld. Now. The tech brought it, still warm from the previous patient, and Megan pressed the probe to his chest, reading the image before anyone else in the room had finished their thought. There. In the pericardial space. A dark fluid collection. Blood pooling around his heart like a fist slowly closing, squeezing the chambers smaller and smaller, until there wouldn't be enough room left for it to beat. Cardiac tamponade. The kind of injury that killed soldiers in the field hospitals outside Tikrit because they didn't have the equipment, or the authorization, all the time. The kind that killed them on transport helicopters because the flight surgeon couldn't move fast enough. The kind that was about to kill this ranger in the trauma bay at Mercy General at 2:51 a.m. if she didn't do something in the next 90 seconds. His blood pressure was dropping already, 118 down to 104 in 4 minutes. His jugular veins were distending, swollen, engorged, the classic sign of something pressing against the chambers from the outside. His heart sounds were muffled, as if someone had wrapped them in cotton. The monitor showed a tachycardia that was getting worse, his heart rate climbing to 132, then 144, the organ panicking as it tried to push against the pressure, tried to force blood through a system that was being compressed from all sides. Get him to surgery, Dr. Hargrove barked, appearing in the doorway with a kind of absolute authority that only came from 20 years of being the final word on every decision that mattered. Call the OR team, prep the operating room. I want blood bank standing by for massive transfusion protocol. Move. 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 His people scattered. The OR nurses jumped. The surgeon was giving orders, and they obeyed with a kind of automatic deference that came from a hierarchy that had been established long before Megan arrived at Mercy General. She didn't move. Pericardiocentesis kit, Megan said, her voice cutting through the urgency like a blade through silk. 18-gauge spinal needle. Ultrasound to my left. Someone get the light. She was already moving the probe, mapping the exact trajectory to the fluid collection, marking the safest approach on his chest with her thumbnail to create a visual reference for the needle path. Hargrove's head snapped toward her. Absolutely not. You are not authorized for procedural interventions. That's for the OR surgeon, not a bedside nurse. She met his eyes for exactly 1 second. Not defiant. Not aggressive. Just a person who had seen what it took to survive something that wanted you dead, and who understood exactly what 8 minutes to the operating room meant when someone had 90 seconds worth of blood volume remaining. Then you'll have my license, Megan said, and turned back to the ultrasound. Marcus, position him. Left lateral decubitus, rotate him toward me. The EMT moved without hesitation, supporting the ranger's weight, rolling him gently so his left side was elevated, exposing the subxiphoid approach, the soft space beneath his sternum where the needle could slide upward and backward into the pericardial sac without hitting lung or liver or any of the other structures that would kill you if you were wrong. Hargrove took a step toward her. Actually moved toward her, as if he was going to physically stop her, put his hands on her shoulders and remove her from the bedside. She didn't flinch. If you touch me, I report it, Megan said quietly, still focused on the ultrasound screen, still positioning the probe, still calculating the angle. Restraining a nurse during an emergency procedure. That gets you a state board review. You want to take that chance, doctor? His shadow fell across the screen, then moved away. He pulled his phone out as he turned for the door, already dialing, already setting the next piece of his retribution in motion, but his footsteps receded and she had her space. The kit arrived. The nurse, a tech named Jasmine who'd been with the hospital for 3 years and had never questioned an order in her life, handed Megan the spinal needle, the 18-gauge, the sharp point gleaming in the fluorescent light that suddenly felt brighter than it had before. The alcohol prep. The steady hand. the ultrasound guiding every millimeter. Megan's hands didn't shake. They never did. Muscle memory took over. The same hands that had done this in a field hospital outside Fallujah with a headlamp and a prayer, that had aspirated fluid from a pericardial sac while bullets were close enough to hear, that had trusted her own training more than she'd trusted the voice of fear, those hands moved now with the same precision. The needle went in beneath the sternum at a 45-degree angle, advancing slowly, watching the ultrasound image, the needle tip appearing as a bright line on the screen, moving toward the dark fluid collection. 15 millimeters. 20. 25. The resistance changed. The needle entered the pericardial space, and she began gentle aspiration, drawing back on the syringe. Blood filled the barrel. Dark blood. 60 cubic centimeters of it came out before the syringe was full, and the ranger's body responded immediately. His blood pressure climbed. 70. 80. 90 systolic. His heart sounds became distinct again, clear, the two chambers working against each other with the percussion of life returning. His color changed. The gray receded. Oxygen came back to his skin. The monitor's steady rhythm became a song instead of a dirge. "We're stable," Marcus whispered, and his voice cracked just slightly. O2 sat is 94. That's, you saved him. Right there. You saved him. The room was silent except for the monitor's steady beep and the sound of the 4-pump clicking, pushing fluids into the ranger's system, replacing what he'd lost. No one moved. No one spoke. Megan disposed of the syringe, the needle, the used prep materials, and stepped back from the bed with the kind of composure that only came from having already survived the worst thing a person could survive. The door burst open. Hargrove returned, his face white, then red, the color rising up his neck like water filling a glass. He saw his patient, alive, stable, breathing steadily, the fluid collection on ultrasound reduced to nearly nothing. He saw Marcus, who'd been in the military, who'd recognized the rank insignia hanging unseen beneath Megan's scrubs. He saw the 75th Regiment patch, still clutched in Megan's left hand, the patch she'd found and kept as evidence without even knowing why. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Turned and walked out without another word, phone already at his ear, already making the calls that would attempt to destroy the career of the woman who'd just saved the life of a soldier while he was barking orders that would have been too late. Within an hour, Hargrove's face had cycled from white to crimson, a color that seemed to feed his rage rather than deflate it. He stood in his office with the door locked, phone pressed to his ear, his voice carrying the precise articulation of a man executing a calculated strike. The pericardiocentesis report was already in his hands, witnessed, documented, undeniable. A nursing procedure. A spinal needle. A scope of practice violation he could weaponize into career termination. His first call went to Gerald Winters, board member. 3 surgical groups owed Hargrove their referral pipelines. Winters answered on the second ring. Gerald. We have a problem at Mercy General. A nurse, O'Brien, first name Megan, just performed an invasive surgical intervention without physician authorization. Pericardiocentesis. Full needle decompression. Hargrove's voice was calm, almost conversational. The voice of a man who knew exactly how to use institutional leverage. I need the board to move fast on this. Investigation. Credential review. Everything. Winters's response was audible even from outside the office. How fast are we talking? Today. Before she can manufacture a narrative. The second call went to Patricia Cole. Her husband's practice depended on Hargrove's patient referrals, a dependency that translated into obligation. Cole listened to the same recitation, the same request, and offered the same compliance. By the time Hargrove disconnected, he'd already been promised an emergency session with the Georgia Nursing Board's disciplinary committee. The machinery was in motion. Then came the call that would set everything else into place. A private investigator in Atlanta, someone Hargrove had used before for credentialing disputes. I need you to pull transcripts from Atlanta Regional Nursing Program. Student name, Megan Elizabeth O'Brien. Enrollment dates 2008 through 2010. I need confirmation she actually completed the program, or evidence that she didn't. Hargrove paused. And I need it before EOB. What he didn't know, what no one in the hospital knew, was that Megan had indeed completed that program. She'd enrolled between deployments, maintained perfect grades, and earned her license through conventional channels. The program existed. The transcripts existed. But the dates on her official work history didn't quite align with those months because those months officially didn't exist. They fell into a gap, a void created 15 years ago when Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien was extracted from Tikrit after the safe house collapse, when her entire service record was classified and sealed, when she was ordered to disappear into civilian life and never surface. The records wouldn't match because the gaps in her timeline were by design, by federal mandate, by a level of security clearance that even the Georgia Nursing Board couldn't touch. But Hargrove didn't know that. He only knew he was pulling a thread, and in his experience, threads always unraveled. By 8 a.m. the next morning, a woman in a grey suit was sitting in HR with a leather folder open on her lap. The private investigator had been thorough. The transcripts from Atlanta Regional checked out perfectly. Megan had completed every requirement. But the dates. The PI had found the inconsistency and flagged it in her report. Student maintained continuous enrollment 2008 to 2010, but employment records show gaps of 4 to 6 months during summer periods that don't align with standard academic calendars. Recommend verification of concurrent employment claims. It wasn't fraud. It was just enough to suggest something irregular. Just enough to justify an investigation. By 1400 hours, Megan was sitting across from Hospital Administrator James Lewis in his office on the 4th floor. The window behind him framed the humid Georgia afternoon, palm trees barely moving in the heat. Lewis's hands were clasped on his desk, his expression carefully neutral, the expression of a man delivering consequences he hadn't personally chosen. Megan, we've received a complaint from Dr. Hargrove regarding a procedure you performed yesterday. Cardiac tamponade intervention, pericardiocentesis, without physician supervision or authorization. Lewis's voice was measured, professional, the voice of policy enforcement. The Georgia Nursing Board takes scope of practice violations very seriously. We're required to launch an immediate investigation. Megan didn't move. Her hands were perfectly still on her lap, shoulders square, eyes forward. The composure of someone who'd already survived worse than institutional bureaucracy. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending the outcome of that investigation. Security will escort you to collect your personal items and then off the premises. Your badge and credentials are being held pending the board's findings. Lewis slid an envelope across the desk. Your suspension notice. Read it carefully. If you have a response, submit it in writing within 5 business days. Megan picked up the envelope. The paper was heavy, official, final. She stood, set it down on the desk, and met Lewis's eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Understood, she said. There was nothing else to say. Nothing that wouldn't break the protocol that had been written into her bones 15 years ago. The walk to her locker took her through the main hallway. Staff members who'd been friendly yesterday suddenly found their phones fascinating. A resident she'd trained on airway management stepped into a supply closet rather than make eye contact. The break room fell silent as she passed. The ranger she'd saved, the one whose life she'd bought with a spinal needle and steady hands, was in the ICU 3 floors up, asking for her. They'd already told him she wouldn't be available. The parking lot was furnace heat and cicada screams, that sound like metal being torn in slow motion, relentless and primal. Megan's locker was in the staff section, a small metal rectangle that had held her life for 8 months. Stethoscope. Reference cards. A photo of Emma from 2 years ago, when her daughter was still young enough to believe her mother had a normal job. Megan pulled everything out and placed it in a small cardboard box she found beside the dumpster. The fluorescent badge with her photo and credentials, the credentials she'd earned legitimately, even if the timeline of her life was a classified document, went into a separate envelope. She sat in her car for 7 minutes without starting the engine, her hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her tethered. Then she drove home through Savannah traffic, her scrub still damp with the day's sweat and the antiseptic smell of the hospital clinging to the fabric like a ghost. The kitchen was where Emma found her at 3:44 p.m. Megan was still in her scrubs, still wearing the shoes she'd been standing in since dawn. The kitchen table, the one where she and Emma ate breakfast most mornings before school, the one where they did homework and talked about the small catastrophes of middle school life, was where she sat with her shoulders curved inward, her hands pressed flat against the table surface as if they might float away if she didn't anchor them. The tears came silently. Not gasping sobs, not the theatrical breakdown of someone who needed to be witnessed. Just tears, hot and steady, dripping onto her folded hands, each one a tiny rebellion against the composure she'd been trained to maintain. Emma's footsteps on the tile were careful, tentative. She'd learned in the last 8 months to read her mother's silences, to understand that some injuries didn't show on skin. She was 12 years old and already wise in the way that children become wise when they learn their parents' fragility. Mom. Emma's voice was small, careful, the voice of a child asking a question she was afraid to hear answered. Why are you home? Did you get fired for helping people again? The question should have been devastating. Instead, it was the thing that finally broke something that needed breaking. Megan looked up at her daughter, at this girl who'd been born in a military hospital in Germany, who'd lived in 7 different houses, who'd learned to pack and move and exist in the spaces her mother had created, and pulled her close without speaking. Emma was small enough to fit against her mother's chest, small enough that Megan could rest her chin on her daughter's head and just breathe. They stayed like that while the Savannah afternoon pressed against the windows, while somewhere in the hospital Megan had just been forced to abandon. The Army Ranger she'd saved was asking why the nurse with the steady hands had disappeared, while Dr. Hargrove was probably pouring a drink and already composing the next narrative that would cement her exile. Megan held her daughter and didn't try to answer, because the answer was complicated and classified and written in languages she'd sworn never to speak aloud. Emma didn't need an explanation. She just needed her mother to hold her back with the same fierce protectiveness that had kept them both alive through deployments and separations and all the invisible costs that came with loving someone whose first loyalty had always been to something larger than themselves. The cicadas screamed outside, and Megan O'Brien, Senior Chief Petty Officer, callsign Steady, the woman whose service record had been erased and whose identity had been buried 15 years ago in a classified vault, sat at her kitchen table and held her daughter and wept in the only way she knew how. Silently. Completely. Alone. What she didn't know yet, what no one in that hospital knew except the ranger upstairs who was about to ask the only question that mattered, was that the sound she was about to hear the next afternoon would change everything. The sound of rotor blades descending through humid Georgia air, military grade and impossible to ignore, moving with the kind of purpose that didn't ask permission. The parking lot was empty except for her locker on wheels, cardboard box half filled with 8 months of her life, stethoscope, trauma shears with her call sign etched into the metal, a single photograph of Emma at age 6. The humidity pressed down like a weight. Savannah summer air hung thick enough to taste, and Megan moved through it with the economy of someone who'd learned long ago not to waste motion. That's when she heard it. Rotor blades cutting through the thick Georgia afternoon like a knife through silk. Not a medevac bird. Not some local news helicopter. This was military grade, the sound of a UH-60M Black Hawk moving with purpose that didn't request permission. The rotor wash shook her locker, sent papers tumbling across the asphalt. The wind carried the smell of diesel and ozone, the particular scent of military aircraft that Megan hadn't breathed in 15 years. The bird descended toward the helipad on Mercy General's roof in a controlled spiral, rotors creating a percussion that made every car alarm in the parking lot shriek. Orderlies came running out of the ER doors. Visitors stopped mid-step. The entire hospital turned its face upward like a flower following sun. Megan didn't look up. She kept packing. But her hand stopped moving. 6 soldiers emerged from the doors of Mercy General's emergency room in tactical synchronization, boots hitting tile in unison. Their uniforms were dress blues, formal, ceremonial, not field gear. They moved through the corridors with the kind of bearing that made lesser personnel unconsciously step aside. One of them, a man with silver oak leaf clusters on his collar, a commander, led the formation. His eye scanned the nurse's station, the waiting area, the triage desk. "We're looking for Senior Chief O'Brien," he said. His voice carried the kind of weight that didn't need volume. "Call sign steady." "She works here." The nurses behind the desk froze. One of them, Patricia Cole, the one who'd been closest to Megan before Hargrove's campaign, her mouth opened. "Closed." The commander's gaze settled on Megan's supervisor, whose name was on the badge. Now would be good. Out in the parking lot, Emma had followed her mother outside without being asked. She was 12, with her mother's eyes and her mother's ability to read a room like it was written in a language only the two of them spoke. She stood beside the locker on wheels, watching the helicopter rotate on the roof pad, watching uniformed soldiers emerge from the hospital doors like something from a dream. "Mom," Emma said quietly. "They called you Senior Chief." Megan's hand stilled. The cardboard box hung at her side, half-packed, useless. Inside the ER, the formation moved with the precision of men who'd done this exact thing in places that didn't exist on maps. They walked past the triage desk, past the break room where colleagues had learned to scatter whenever Megan entered, past the supply closets and the medication stations. They walked directly to the trauma bay where the Army Ranger was sitting up in bed, chest-wrapped but breathing, the kind of breathing that meant the pericardiocentesis had held, meant he was alive because of her needle and her hands and her refusal to wait for permission. He saw them and his jaw tightened. Not fear. Recognition. The SEAL commander stepped forward, and the Ranger stood, shouldering aside the forestand, moving with the careful precision of a man who'd learned his body was still his to command. He saluted. "Sir," the Ranger said. The commander didn't return it. Not yet. Instead, he opened a file. The pages were stamped with headers that hadn't existed for Megan O'Brien in 15 years, declassified. Executive Order. Authorization Code Red Alpha 7. The Ranger's hands trembled as he read aloud, as if the words themselves required physical strength, 2 bronze stars. His voice cracked. "Silver Star." Another pause. "Navy Cross for Valor under fire during Operation Phantom Fury." The fluorescent lights buzzed above them. Somewhere in the distance, an ambulance siren wailed. 19. The Ranger continued, reading, consecutive combat medical deployments. 0 casualties preventable through negligence. 78 confirmed lives saved through emergency procedures performed in theater and subsequent civilian emergency response. Highest classification level in the Special Operations Command Medical Corps. In the parking lot, Megan lowered the box. Back inside, the SEAL commander turned as Dr. Hargrove appeared at the trauma bay entrance. His posture was wrong. He'd been standing at the nurse's station when security had informed him that uniformed soldiers were requesting information about a nurse. He'd expected to find them, and instead they'd found the Ranger. Found the file. Found everything. Hargrove wasn't alone. He'd positioned 2 security officers beside him, the visible manifestation of his institutional authority. His smugness was a visible thing, a shield he'd built from 15 years of unopposed arrogance. He smiled. That was his first mistake. The commander's gaze moved to him like a laser sight acquiring a target. "Dr. Hargrove," the commander said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Hargrove confirmed, chin elevated. "And I'd like to know what this is about. This is an active trauma bay, and I'm not sure. Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien is hereby recalled to active duty," the commander said. His voice was level, professional, the kind of voice that had given orders in Tikrit and Kandahar and 100 places that didn't make the evening news. "Her record has been declassified per executive order. She will assume the position of lead instructor for the Navy's Advanced Combat Medical Training Program, effective immediately." Hargrove's smile didn't waver, but his eyes changed. The light went out of them, replaced by something that looked like calculation. He was trying to understand how to spin this, how to maintain control of the narrative. Furthermore, The commander continued, any individual who interfered with, impeded, or retaliated against Senior Chief O'Brien in her civilian capacity will answer directly to the Department of Defense Inspector General. Hargrove started to speak. I was protecting patient safety. A figure stepped forward from behind the formation. FBI, though his badge remained hidden. He'd been standing so quietly that even Hargrove hadn't registered his presence. The kind of man who could be in a room without being noticed. The kind of man who gathered evidence while others thought they were winning. Dr. Hargrove, the FBI agent said, we've been investigating Mercy General's billing practices for 6 months. Your insurance fraud scheme, phantom surgical consults, procedures billed but never performed, kickbacks from imaging centers to your private practice, we have emails, financial records, and testimony from 4 board members who've already accepted cooperation agreements. Hargrove's face went pale. Not the ashen shock of a man caught in a minor indiscretion. The visceral horror of a man watching his entire power structure evaporate in real time. Ms. O'Brien's questions about your billing practices triggered your retaliation campaign, the FBI agent continued. He was reading from a document now, each word another brick in the wall. Fabricated disciplinary reports. Suborning witnesses. False complaints filed with the Georgia Medical Board. Defamation with intent to damage her professional reputation and employment. In the parking lot, the rotor blade slowed. Megan stood perfectly still, hands at her sides, the cardboard box forgotten on the asphalt. Inside the trauma bay, Hospital Administrator Lewis had appeared in the doorway. His face was a map of political calculation, a man suddenly realizing which way the wind was blowing. He was reviewing his own vulnerability, his own exposure, his knowledge of what Hargrove had done and whether he'd been complicit through silence. The FBI agent turned to face Lewis directly. Your facility received notice of billing irregularities from your nursing staff. Those concerns were not escalated. Instead, the nurse who raised them was isolated, harassed, and ultimately suspended. You've been copied on every email regarding her performance review. You had knowledge. Lewis opened his mouth. Closed it. His hands trembled slightly. However, the agent said, we're not interested in you. We're interested in the man who created the system. Security officers moved forward. Not hospital security. Federal agents, and they had badges that meant something very different than institutional authority. One of them placed a hand on Hargrove's shoulder. Not rough. Just firm. Final. Dr. Gregory Hargrove, the senior agent said, you're under arrest for healthcare fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and retaliation against a federal military officer. Hargrove's face went the color of spoiled meat. His mouth worked, but no sound emerged. The shield of authority he'd built, the network of board members and favors and kickbacks and institutional power, it had collapsed the instant the declassified file was opened. I was protecting, he tried again. The only thing you were protecting, the SEAL commander said, was your billing scheme. Hospital Administrator Lewis found his spine somewhere in the next 3 seconds. Dr. Hargrove, you're terminated, effective immediately. Security, remove him from this building. The security officers, actual hospital security, confused and watching their world restructure, didn't move until an FBI agent gestured. Then they understood. They took Hargrove's arms with the gentle firmness of men escorting a problem off the premises. He walked out of the trauma bay the same way he'd entered everything else in his career, under his own power, with his head raised, refusing to acknowledge that his world had become dust. But by the time he reached the main lobby, his control had fractured. He started to struggle. His voice rose. You can't do this. I built this department. I built this entire program. You're making a mistake. I'll sue. I'll fight this. You don't understand what you're doing. Phones came out. A visiting family in the waiting area hit record. A resident watched with their eyes wide. Nurses who'd avoided Megan for months watched their champion being walked out in the grip of federal agents. Hargrove's voice cracked. Patricia, call my lawyer. Patricia! Patricia Cole sat at the desk, her phone in her hand, and she did nothing. In the parking lot, Emma watched the helicopter rotors slow to a stop. 6 soldiers were emerging back through the hospital doors now, and they were moving toward the parking lot with the same synchronized purpose they'd brought into the building. One of them held an olive drab box. The SEAL commander found Megan standing beside the locker on wheels. He saluted her. Not a casual gesture. A full formal salute, chest high, executed with the precision of decades. Megan returned it without hesitation. Her hand rose from her side, sharp and clean and practiced. "Welcome back," the commander said. Inside the olive drab box was everything that had been locked away for 15 years. Medals. Commendations. Letters from presidents and generals and Special Operations Command. And at the bottom, the combat badge. The faded 75th Regiment insignia that she'd hand-sewn into her jacket lining the day she'd been ordered to disappear, the day her entire service record had been classified so thoroughly that officially, Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien had never existed. She held the badge in her palm. It was smaller than she remembered. Everything was. Emma stepped forward and took her mother's hand. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you," Megan said to her daughter. "For so long." "I'm sorry." "Mom," Emma said, "you held more lives together than anyone in this hospital ever will." The commander nodded to one of the soldiers, who produced dress blues, Navy Medical Corps insignia, ribbons that caught the Georgia sun like light through water. The uniform of someone no longer hiding. The uniform of someone coming home. Megan changed in the hospital bathroom, Emma waiting outside the door. When she emerged, the combat badge was pinned above her ribbons, right where it belonged. 15 years of classified service finally visible. 15 years of carrying weight in silence finally acknowledged. The commander stood at attention. All 6 soldiers stood at attention. "Senior Chief O'Brien," the commander said, "the United States Navy requests your immediate recall to active duty. You will train the next generation of combat medical officers. You will teach them to save lives with the precision and courage you've demonstrated across 3 continents. You will ensure that no operator ever bleeds out because their medic wasn't trained by the best." Megan's jaw was steady. Her eyes were clear. "It would be my honor, sir," she said. The rotor blades spun up again as they walked toward the helicopter. Emma held her mother's hand on one side, the SEAL commander flanked her on the other, and 6 soldiers created a perimeter that made it absolutely clear she was no longer alone in this. 3 months later, Dr. Hargrove received 18 months federal prison for healthcare fraud, his medical license permanently revoked, $340,000 in restitution ordered. He was teaching CPR classes at Savannah Community College for $15 an hour now, prohibited from ever holding a medical license again. The article about his conviction ran on page 7 of the Georgia Medical Board's newsletter. Megan never saw it. She was at Naval Medical Center San Diego, standing in dress blues with every ribbon she'd earned, teaching a classroom full of young combat medics the precise angle for emergency pericardiocentesis, the procedure that had saved the Ranger's life, the procedure that had brought her home. Emma sat in the back row, wearing her mother's old unit t-shirt, watching with pride. The combat badge was pinned above every ribbon, right where it belonged. After class, the Ranger found her. He was fully recovered, returned to duty, moving with the fluidity of a man given a second life. "I named my daughter Megan," he said. "She was born last week." Megan's eyes shined. "She's got a strong name to live up to." Emma's voice was soft as they walked through the hospital hallway together, other medical personnel saluting as they passed. "Mom, were you scared when they made you disappear?" Megan held her daughter's hand. "Every day. But some things are worth being scared for. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs." If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated or watched someone sacrifice their integrity for institutional power, subscribe and let me know. Have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Comment below. And if you know someone in healthcare or military service who carries invisible weight, share this. They might need to know that coming home is always possible.